Happy to be joined today on the Five Tool podcast by two big-time guests. First, University of Texas head coach David Pierce and Alan Jaeger, founder of Jeager Sports, one of the foremost experts on pretty much just the baseball game in general. But I know today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about just throwing and getting back to the basics of throwing. And guys, David, Alan, you two, I believe, talked last night over the phone. I mean, just talking through topics and things like that. And, we kind of, before we started recording, just heard the passion about where this is kind of resonating from and getting back to throwing and things like that. So first off, thanks for joining us. And secondly, kind of share the thought process behind wanting to kind of hop on here and talk through really just kind of getting back to focusing on throwing again and the importance of that.
Yeah, I think I'll start on that, Alan. I kind of shifted gears. I was a head coach. I have been a head coach for quite a few years now, but I was also the pitching coach at Rice University from 06 up until really my first 2 years here in 18. And it was good. But as I migrated back into head coach / pitching coach, is when I reached back out to Alan and just said, hey, I want to validate some things that I believe in. And Alan and I go back early 2000s. So just watching his career and how well he's done, but also, using him as a resource and using him as a somewhat of a foundation from afar, but then kind of rekindling that. And both our passions came back out of, what are we missing? I think more than ever before, we're just not throwing enough, and we're not throwing at the correct times and timing. And I think it's just a critical time to discuss it going into the back end of the summer, early fall. And, we're with one of the best that understands it better than anybody.
Well, first of all, thanks, David. And it's great to be on here with you guys. It's great to be on here with David. Dave and I have had a number of talks in the last couple of weeks, and I think he put it best. We just both share a passion for throwing and athleticism and feel, and we both know there's a time and a place for all these other supplemental ways to prepare the arm, and it's great that we have these resources, but I think the thing that he and I keep coming back to, and I know it's a thing that at Jaeger Sports we talk about all the time. Our video, it's funny, Drew, I think you mentioned it off camera here, Thrive on Throwing. I mean, think about those. It's funny we came up with that title. I actually love that title of that video. That came out in 2000, 23 years ago. Thrive on Throwing. I mean, it doesn't get much simpler than that. And granted, that was before a lot of these newer tools were coming out, but in a nutshell, I'm with David in the sense that we have such a passion for arm development, arm care, throwing, but I think also how that pertains to really tuning into the athlete. And I would actually say tuning into more of the intuitive part of the person.
Yeah, something that we talked about is seems to be, like you mentioned, there's a lot of gadgets, a lot of programs out there. And I think what you've been touching on is really important, the importance of throwing and what that looks like, in a couple of different phases. It's a year-round calendar. And from our end, what the tough thing to navigate when we're planning events and tournaments and all that is, I think you've seen an uptick of stuff that's available for guys to do in the fall and early winter. And, there's a lot of question out there, especially from the people that we're around, like what, from a schedule standpoint, what makes sense? What should a fall look like for a high school kid or a college kid? And, I think that's something that the people that listen to this will be super interested in. And, I know you've put together numerous amounts of programs and different protocols for guys at different stages, whether it's, the guys coming off rehab, guys, in high school that are on a year-long cycle, and then getting as granular as relief pitchers versus starters. So just talk a little bit about that, and how you view the schedule because like Dustin mentioned, it's a crucial part of the calendar, whether people know it or not, in that being in that transition phase from the end of summer going into the fall.
Yeah, I would say that it's a great question, actually. I kind of look at it like these waves. I grew up in LA, grew up going to the beach, did a lot of body surfing. I feel very connected to the ocean, very connected to waves. And we all know there's a lot of power behind nature. There's a lot of power behind the wave. And so if you really just started from scratch, you would say there's probably a 4 to 5 week period, and throwing, by the way, at least six times a week. So let's get that out there out front. We're talking about throwing today. But there's a 4 to 5 week buildup, mainly for older kids, high school and up, maybe not as much for the younger kids. So if you just start from the premise that you need 4 to 5 weeks just to get your arm into great shape, forget about penning and all that stuff. Well, then you have that period. And then you have an integration of what we call more higher intent throwing. We call them pull downs. That might start happening every other day. But let's just call all that getting into optimal shape, 6 weeks. Then you have 3 weeks of integrating mound work, let's say twice a week, penning. So now you're at 9 weeks. And then you can start your live stuff. That's week 10, or let's say 15, 20 pitches in the live outing. So you're at 10 weeks just to get to that first live inning, or 15 to 20 pitches.
Right.
The reason why I'm doing this is I love to reverse engineer everything. Anytime someone comes to us and says, hey, I want to be at this point on this date, I'm like, well, as long as we know the target date, we can reverse engineer it. Now we need to figure out, what did you do the last week, month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, right? So I'd say in a nutshell, the main thing is that you have to be always cognizant that there is a buildup period. Now it's based on where you've come from again. But you have to know it's a buildup period, and then you have to know that prior to the buildup period, you need to have come probably out of a rest period, and as David said earlier, an active rest period. So in our manual, in a nutshell, we just sort of walk you through all these different phases so that you're highly aware of what it looks like. And then, as you guys know, we all know this, well, that's a perfect scenario where we're starting from scratch. We know where we're at. We can build it up, because we all know there's tons of variables, like kids coming out of the summer right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just say that you have to just really know where the player is at, what they've done the last few months, and where they want to be. But to just know, generally speaking, you really need a very thorough buildup prior to getting on a mound, as a rule of thumb.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, Alan. When I look at and listen to you, we also think about, professional baseball is becoming much more of a year-round training, and different than as before. You should go play 7 months, 4 months is kind of we take off, active rest, you do other things, and then you start your ramp up or your build up and your timing to go into spring training. Now guys are reporting ready to go. And I think that's what's interesting for us, is the cycle and how we handle the cycle of the wind, the frequency, the volume, really just the timing to start everything. And I find it interesting because I'll talk to recruits, and it'll be in maybe late July or, a couple of weeks ago, and just say, how are you right now? What are you doing? What you're throwing? And I get all kinds of answers. I mean, from full-fledged bullpens to rest to just, there's no consistency. And I think more than anything for me is to get consistency back in our program, where they feel exactly, when we report, where they should be into our buildup. I like the term reverse engineering. I kind of think about, if you're playing for, an opportunity to play in Omaha, so you look at Omaha and you work back. So it's the same sequence. So when you look at that, you go, all right, what's the goal here for the fall? If I'm going to compete, how do I work my build up around it? If I've competed and thrown, 100+ innings spring and summer, now I have a little more rest period. What does the fall look like? And then what does the winter back into your buildup look like? And I think educating young high school and even college kids, to a point of knowing their sequence and knowing their cycle is really going to help them create a better routine.
Yeah, and you know, one thing I've wondered with pitching is I've always kind of in my head, I'm like, how do players know what they should be doing at different times of the year? Like, and you know, Alan, what you're referring to, like you've actually written, you know, the manual for this, the year-round throwing manual, like, and it's not just like a couple of months you should be doing this. It's like down to like the point of the calendar. It's like, hey, if you're doing something in December, here's where you should be, that sort of thing. Because in my head, I'm like, man, like people just kind of go out and they start doing things, but there's not really, you know, any sort of guideline as to where you should be at that point in the year. So you've actually written the manual for this. And for both of you guys, you know, this time of the year being so critical, like how important is it to know where you are, know where your body is, and approach it the right way? Because, and David, I'm sure you've seen this sometimes in your program, if guys don't stick to what they should be doing, you can do more harm than good. And then the spring goes around, you're kind of wondering, whoa, why aren't I doing this, or why aren't I performing like I thought I should?
Well, couple things. One is it goes back to knowing where the players are at. When every kid comes back, I know David was just talking about doing his recon. You know, if I'm a coach, high school or college, the first thing I'm doing is I have to do deep recon on what the players have done, not only in the summer, but going back to the spring if they weren't in our program. Like David mentioned the term 100 innings. You know, like you have to know, like I said, to really get a feel for not only where you're at, but where you're going, is you have to know where you've come from, of course. So I think the first thing you have to do is great recon on every player or every pitcher for sure. You have to know where the pitchers are at for more obvious reasons than position players. It's good to know where the position players are at too. And then once you understand that, you can build something around it. And I'm going to use a really good example David touched on. I've talked to college coaches who have had pitchers with a heavy fall, well, a normal fall, winter, heavy spring, heavy summer, right? Maybe like Team USA where they're traveling into Europe. I mean, like really deep into the summer. And I've pretty much convinced them because we have a pro manual too. And the pro manual is beautiful because of something David said. More organizations now, when the season's over, these guys might take a week or two off, and they may not do a whole lot of anything, but they might throw 60 feet 3 days a week, right? I mean, they may do some light things for a month or two, but they're moving the body, as David said, moving the arm. So I've had scenarios, just to kind of give you one example of your you know, your great question, which is I've had coaches say basically, look, let's treat this like a pitcher getting ready for spring training February 15th or March 1st, right? Meaning let him, when he gets back from that long summer, let's call it September 1st, we're immediately going into what's called the deload for 2 or 3 weeks, where he's just sort of backing down. Then he might go into a month of rest or whatever it is, where it still might be, you know, bands and some light stuff. But then he's going to go into about another month of active rest, which is a lot of bands and maybe some light throwing. And here's the point. That pitcher's not pitching in the fall, right? He's just doing this wave back to the wave. He's just doing this long wave of deloading, resting, active resting, and then building up slowly. I call it a slow burn from our pro manual because we have a lot more time before spring training. But essentially what I'm saying is in college, let's say David's first game this year is February 15th or so. Well, all of a sudden now, here we talk about reverse engineering and target date. Well, if I know February 15th is the start date for my pitcher that just had a really long run through September 1st, I'm trusting the fact that as much as I want him to throw, he can still do some competitive stuff probably around November, December, however it works out. It's in there, or January even. But I just want this slow wave to build for February 15th because he's tired. He's had a lot to do, and I don't need to rush him into fall ball, as important as it is to get him some innings and evaluate him. I have to trust the fact that it's way more important to let him rest, let him recover, let him rebuild, and just really set him up for this strong run from February 15th through the season. So I think that's one, you know, angle to kind of, you know, attack that question.
Alan, let me jump in on the deload portion of that. Because, you know, in Texas, we have a lot of kids that play football, right, in the fall. And, you know, for them, I think a lot of them look at that as their down period and downtime of throwing. But I think people, when they hear deload or taking time off, I think in our world where we sit down in the high school level, that can be misunderstood to be not throwing at all. Can you shed a little light on that as far as what the deload looks like from a throwing standpoint? And is there ever a period of time where you just, in your program, where you just flat put the ball down and aren't throwing at all?
So it's a great question. I love giving people credit that have taught me things along my path. Randy Sullivan is someone from the Florida Baseball Armory I lean on all the time. He's kind of a physical therapist, sort of think Eric Cressy, meets pitching coach, and he's just brilliant. And he's the first guy that I really got into deloading, and because of him, it got into our throwing manual for the pro side. And I may have touched on it in our year-round manual, but think of it this way. This is happening at a chemical level. When the body trains, you can think about, something as simple as like lifting that everybody can relate to. And I'm not going to do this justice, but there's whether it's tendons, ligaments, whether there's chemical communications that's happening that's getting the body in shape. When the season's over, the idea is you don't want to shock the system and stop. Even in a pro season where they go through the World Series in October, they should, and this is straight from Randy, there really should be at least a 3-week period where you start to deload the body, meaning you just start to subtract. And I use the simple analogy in our pro manual, 20% a week. So here's an example. Let's say the last outing of a pitcher, he threw 100 pitches in a game and a 35 pitch pen. He still should be throwing, 5-6 days a week. Just subtract 20% of the workload and 20% of the intensity. And then the week 2 is 40%, and then week 3 is 60%. So over a 3-week period, you're kind of undoing what you did, but you're doing it softly and progressively. So really, deloading is more about a long season and backing off properly. And I think the next most important thing is, you talked about rest, Drew. We would say, look, just to be sort of conservative and to not, and to not seem like we're so extreme, we'd say there's nothing wrong with a younger player, especially maybe taking off a month. I always have a caveat with that. If you do nothing else but bands 3 times a week, just to keep the blood flow in the body moving, maybe the integrity of the rotator cuff, with the smaller muscles. I have a rubber arm. I threw a ton growing up. David did as well. We both relate to the feeling of the more you throw, the better you feel. And I mean that, obviously in a smart way, the more you throw. So I kind of have a tough way of answering that question, because I don't really want people shutting down for very long from not doing anything. And I know that might scare some people. Maybe the medical people may not love that comment. So I'd say listen to your arm and your body. But essentially, even if you took that month off, maybe do some even if you took 2 months off, do band work, do movement, keep the body moving, the arm and the body moving. And then the last part I'd say is that now, once you kind of get through that phase of rest, the active rest, which I think is something that's also very misunderstood. Shout out to Eric Cressy now, because I got straight from Eric Cressy a long time ago. Now, active rest is something that I think a lot of us don't really understand what that is. Meaning, I know I didn't. It sounds good. It's a cool term. But here's what it really means. It means that before you get into some real active work with a particular part of your body, in this case throwing, you want to grease the wheel, right? And you want to do that over a period of time, not like once or twice and hey, let's do it. And so as an example, in our pro manual, we go through maybe a month, 4 weeks without throwing, where the band work alone is just ramping up from 3 days a week to 4 days a week to 5 days a week to 6 days a week. Before throwing with the band work, even though it's very light, that can start to ramp up to maybe a couple of sets. So long story short, sorry for the long answer, is that this active rest period, speaking of high school players and playing a different sport, so maybe they can't do a lot of throwing because they're in football or whatever, you mentioned football as an example. They may have a 2-month period where they're not able to throw a lot, but man, they could do a lot of active rest with band work. Even if they just throw a ball into a side wall for 10 or 15 minutes at 60 feet, just grease the wheel, keep the arm moving, start to create a lot of active rest is creating a really healthy, strong, deep base before you start the activity. of throwing. So anyway, I know that was a lot, but it's a very, very important question.
I'm going to add one thing to it, and I would just say the base gets you into the build-up much easier and quicker. You're not going from 0 to 100, and I think that's key. When you listen to Alan and how he presents that, the ability to never really feel like you're completely stagnant, and then you're in a better spot when you start back, and I think that's critical.
And just to say one last thing, because I'm so glad you mentioned that, David, because otherwise you do something that's very dangerous for the arm, which is called shocking the arm. And I love that David, picked up on that, the idea that it's seamless, and we don't want to ever shock the arm, and we want to have this great base in place. And even though we still want guys to and gals to build up slowly and progressively, the idea is if you build the base right, you're in a position to really thrive on how you get into your buildup as well.
That shock phase is also rushed, because now when kids come back, they feel good, they feel active, they're ready to go, and they probably push it and rush it too much. So having that foundation kind of keeps that gradual movement.
Both of you have mentioned a couple of things that I'm passionate about. Obviously, I don't have the background of either of you guys, but we do watch a ton of amateur baseball, and I think that I've noticed over the years, it seems like we're starting to see guys that are kind of getting away from the natural athleticism, the free flowing, the feel of being on the mound and throwing, and are starting to kind of look more rigid and robotic. And Alan kind of goes back to something you say. I think sometimes we're seeing these guys that have these supplements, all these different things they can do that can kind of aid in their development. And if you don't quite know what you're doing, and you get away from simply just throwing and keep greasing that wheel, you start to lose kind of that free flowing, that athleticism, that natural feel. How critical is that? And David, for you especially, because you're recruiting, you're seeing these freshmen come in, you're even seeing the college guys with their development. Have you noticed maybe like that's something that's kind of gone away a little bit? Is because to me, there's no better way of you keep building the feel for throwing by throwing, by getting out there and throwing and having that natural free flowing athleticism on the mound.
It's 2 letters, P-O. As soon as they describe themselves or identify themselves as a pitcher only, many of them get away from their athleticism, their natural movement, their fast twitch. And I think that's the key, is incorporating. I mean, what I want to see from a pitcher is freedom. I want to see fast twitch. I want to see natural slots. I don't want to see a guy go from his long toss to his pull downs to his flat and then go to the pin and looks like a robot. So to maintain that natural movement is kind of the key, and what you get out of so much of, the extension of throwing, getting into your long toss. And not only throwing long toss, even our guys, I feel like we still have to educate them on how to throw long toss, because they literally want to go from the line into 60, 90 feet in a hurry and on the line. And we're trying to just get it long and loose and really let it grow and just really let it extend and feel that. And when they get to that point, the arm's going to open up. It's going to have this freedom. You're going to feel your front side working for you. You're going to feel the mobility in your hips. And then you're really going to get into your legs and try to get out over your front side. And that, to me, is the beauty of the long toss and creating the arc and really kind of having that baseline of how far that is. And I think Alan's really good at kind of describing that, because one guy, your throwing partner, may be, 300, 330 feet, and you're still at 270. So, kind of understanding your own baseline and then kind of creating from there, and then volume. And I'm going to go back to what we say a lot is your arm's going to tell you. And I can't tell you how many throws you should make. Your arm can tell you, and you're the only one that knows. And your body feels that. So you have to have an understanding of that. But if you're not doing that frequently, then you really don't know what it is.
And you can say that throwing, that's awesome, David. It's almost like I'm just going to try to put some icing on top of that cake. Throwing is also an art form, right? And as David just alluded to in several key ways, if you're not going out there to throw, if you don't go out there with the intent, like I'm going out to play catch and throw today and listen to my arm, listen to my body, there's no clock. There's no amount of throws. I love how David said that. One thing I've tweeted out there a number of times is, eliminate the clock, eliminate the counting of throws. Go out there and listen to the body, listen to the arm. You'd be shocked. Dave and I were joking yesterday about BP pitchers. I have a tweet I put out in the past. Who has the most well-conditioned arm on the baseball field? And the answer is the BP pitcher. And granted, yes, I can hear someone say, well, they're not throwing curveballs and sliders, and they're not throwing high intent. Regardless, they're making 400 pitches a week, 400 pitches a day in some cases. But let's just call it 300, 6-7 times a week for 40 years without breaking down. And I think we lose sight of that. I'll tell you another stat that a lot of people don't make this connection with. I shouldn't say they don't make this connection, so I don't know that. I can just tell you a stat that blew me away when I heard it, and I assume that a lot of other people would blow them away, is how many throws do catchers make in spring training, right? First of all, they have to do their own throwing program. They're catching countless bullpens because there's 160 pitchers in camp every day. They're making a ton of throws. And we rarely hear about Tommy John or something like that, shoulder reconstruction with catchers. So this goes really to the heart of what David and I have been talking a lot about previous to this today, is that if you're just not out there throwing and feeling your way through this, that's where I call it the art form. Like, this is an art form. If you don't know what it's like to throw with arc and gradually let that ball get out and feel the stretching and the range of motion and build some volume. David used the word volume a second ago. Volume is so critical to this whole process. And then I made one other note that I'd like to throw out there. That's another huge deal. There's academies that popped up everywhere, and it's wonderful. There's a lot of great coaches at these academies, and these kids are training well. But part of the problem with that is you're indoors. So you don't have the visual and the spatial of seeing, spatial is a word, we'll go with it. You don't have the spaciousness of seeing the ball maybe in the air, right? So the proprioception, the feel, that's a huge deal. And I feel like these kids might go to these academies where they're working on velocity, which is great. We all want to throw harder, right? But if you go to the academies and you're working on velocity, and I'm not saying all academies do this, but chances are if I go to an indoor facility, especially in the wintertime if it's snowing outside, right? I don't know what the chances are of a player who went outside and got up to 300 and 330 feet and got fully extended, right? Conditioned well prior to their velo test, prior to a bullpen. And so I think that the academy concept, or just being indoors, in the wintertime for most of the country, we also lose that connection with that athleticism, that feel, that range of motion, that connection to just throwing. And I think that's also where the arm can get really shocked, is you go to these facilities. And again, I'm just projecting. I haven't been to these facilities and I haven't done research on this, but my gut tells me that, kids are going to these facilities and it's indoors. It's probably very limited space with how much you can throw. And now you're getting after it with, pull downs or running guns and pull downs and running guns are fine at the appropriate time. I just don't know if it's the appropriate time if you're in an indoor facility and you're not first getting that freedom, range of motion, volume, and the connection back to the theme today. Just the connection of just throwing, just throw, get out and play catch.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a two-pronged question. And part of it's going to be directed at Coach Pearson, part of it directed at you, Alan, that both of you can chime in on as well. But, we've gotten through the fall, let's say, on this schedule period. And, I think one of the biggest adjustments for new pitchers coming to college is that at a place like Texas, they've all been a starter. Very few of them have been a reliever before getting on a college campus. And from a schedule standpoint, as far as your protocols, when, if ever, does the throwing protocol change for a guy that's pegged as a starter versus a reliever? And then coach, to you, I remember from my time being there with you, one of the things that I thought that you did that always made a lot of sense and you don't hear people talk about a lot is that when you're recruiting, you're putting together a pitching staff, right? You're not just collecting arms. And I think that means different things to different people, but for the recruiting process, coach, like, what are you looking for to determine, when do you make that determination that a guy is likely a reliever or likely a starter? And then from the scheduling standpoint, when do you start to do different things with the pitchers heading into a season?
You want to go first and answer the front end of that first, Alan?
Dave, you take it and then I'll piggyback.
Okay, so it's a good question, Drew, and it's always a challenge, but in the fall, we're pretty much on the same schedule because we don't have many guys extend past probably 50 pitches. And that's in competition. And so we're in two groups. So we'll go a Monday, Friday. Those are their bullpen days with a heavy day in between and 2 light days, and then a day off afterwards. And that's pretty consistent for both starters and relievers. What we'll also do is continue that pattern once we start competition. And so if we're in our 300 feet throws or our long toss, and we're already in the stage of pull downs into our flat grounds, that volume may be cut down just a hair. So we'll go to the bullpen, get our touch and feel off the slope, and then go directly to competition. It's pretty consistent with most of our guys because of the minimal amount of innings. And we try to give everybody pretty consistent timing of when they're going to pitch. So it's much easier, honestly, in the fall than it is the spring. But we do have some guys that we know are potential 3-inning guys to 1 to 2 inning guys. And so we're a little more frequent with their outings. And that's usually a little bit towards the back end of the fall. So there becomes the challenge of how much volume do we do? How much long toss do we do to make sure that they're maxing? The one thing I think, and Alan and I talked a lot about this as well, is too many times a player has a bullpen that day or he's competing that day. So all of a sudden he's not working through the entire process. So they go very little run conditioning, very little band condition, or maybe heavy there, but then don't get to their full length and their full extension. You can still do that, but just maybe cut down your volume, cut down your pull down volumes consistently. And I think that again goes back to, kind of what is the goal of that day and kind of knowing that. So in the fall, it's easier. In the spring, it gets a little more challenging, but we gain so much information from the fall to start identifying guys so we can put them on a different program in the spring. And it's, the consistency, the frequency is what's different. And just trying to make sure that they're in a good spot when the spring starts and they're called upon.
Yeah, and what I'll do is, because David just nailed it, I'll take the spring because, as he said, the buildup is identical, believe it or not. I mean, give or take. It's just you're getting the arm in the most optimal shape of its life. So that to me is very, very consistent. Obviously the bullpens into the live, that's shorter for not that the bullpens are shorter. Well, maybe they are, but the buildup for the live, of course, is much shorter for a relief pitcher. But the spring, and I actually wrote a little article with Adam Revelette in Inside Pitch Magazine on this topic because I've been very, very frustrated. More in pro ball because they play every day and they get much faster in the mentality that David mentioned about how challenging it is of like saving their arm for the game. That's sort of the mentality because they're there every day. And so they're in a little different situation in college. Even if you pitch twice on the weekend as a reliever, you still have Tuesday technically if you don't pitch on Tuesday, but you kind of have 3 or 4 days in college to kind of restore and rebuild. And you can still have the luxury of getting a lot of throwing and long toss in as a reliever. But I still want to attack this one principle, even though it's really more in pro ball, but it still applies in college and high school, which is this. David hit it on it earlier. The mentality is to save the arm for the game. And he said something earlier, which is super important. They maybe do less with their bands, or even if they do a good job with bands and arm care, they definitely will tend to do less with their throwing. And I would say this, if you're a 300-foot guy, as a simple analogy, or a gal, I always like to make sure we talk about gals too. The bottom line is this, you've been built all fall. So I'm going to use just Texas right now as an example with David. These relief pitchers, February 15th, when the season starts, they're going to be in beast mode, because I know David and I know what he's doing with these kids. So now all of a sudden, let's say game one is February 15th, and let's say you have a reliever go in there and throw 23 pitches. Well, based on his base and his foundation and his throwing acumen, okay, his recovery the next day is going to be a joke. He's going to feel like he probably didn't throw, like a BP pitcher almost. Now, let's just assume it's a Friday, so maybe he might pitch again the next day. Okay, so we can't maybe go to 300 and pull down, but maybe because he feels to go the next day, he can still go to 240 and stretch it out, get some air under the ball, and maybe not do any pull downs. And we call that open the door, but don't close it. And then just keep the arm nice and warm through the rest of the game until you may go in with some light throwing or maybe some bands. But here's the point. He's out to 240. And if he doesn't go in that game on Saturday, then guess what? Now on Sunday, he's closer to maybe 300 feet again. He doesn't have to, right? He might even pull down a little bit because he knows Monday is a day off. So that mentality in college changes dramatically, where all of a sudden these guys can get some pretty good distances and pretty good volume in, even the day of a game, even back-to-back games. And as David said, it just saddens me so much that this mentality is more, once the spring starts, all of a sudden it's like everybody's, I don't want to say everybody, but let's just say the general rule feels like that we're going to now we're going to go to 90 to 120, which happens a lot in pro ball before the game, get loose, and then save our arm for the game. And it's just the opposite. Lance Wheeler had such a great line I picked up years ago, which is, are we worried about hurting ourselves versus are we preparing and conditioning and training ourselves, right? I mean, that's something you have to look at. Are we preparing and training and developing? Are we worried about hurting ourselves? And it doesn't mean you can't be mindful of, like, maybe there is a time to only go out to 90 to 120. Maybe you threw 40 pitches on Friday and then, or 20 pitches on Friday, and then it got extended a little bit on Saturday. So maybe on Sunday, you only go out to 120 feet. Here's the irony. I still think at 120 feet, you might throw it for 15 to 20 minutes, not 4. You're definitely not going at 60 feet for 5 minutes and shutting it down. And I think this is the back to the theme of today. I just feel like the more, something Dave and I talked about last night, the more you just live in this world of throwing in a smart way and listening to the body and conditioning, and you don't have to always throw with high intent. You can do a lot of throwing with low intent. I call them massage throws. You can do a massage throw up to 250 feet. You can do massage throwing at 120 feet for, David and I can go out right now and probably do 120-foot massage throws for an hour. And we will both, and I haven't thrown in months, and I do a lot of bands because of tennis, and I can almost assure you that tomorrow, if I have any soreness, it's going to be a good sore. It's going to feel good. Okay, so I think that we have to get back to this idea of the body is resilient, and that, especially if you do it right and build this thing up progressively and listen to the body, our body, let's go back to the 400 pitches a day, 6 to 7 days a week of a BP pitcher for 40 years and not breaking down, catchers not having very many Tommy Johns. I mean, I think we have to be smart about it. I'm not saying, just go out there and with reckless abandon, but I just think that we've erred on the side of being too conservative. And I just feel like that this topic today is so cool because, man, we need this infusion of this awareness again.
Well said.
Alan, you mentioned something I really, really like is, are we preparing to throw and to go out and keep throwing, or are we kind of holding back in fear of getting hurt for some reason? And beyond, I think the obvious is the importance of really listening to your arm and listening to your body. I mean, only as you guys have both said, only how the arm feels, how your body feels, and what kind of limits and what kind of throwing you can do. What would you say are those other critical components for arm care? Because I think, like you kind of alluded to, didn't say directly, I think too often people associate, maybe throwing with not taking care of your arm, and it doesn't really kind of make sense. Like, why would you just shut down and not move and not keep that arm going, and if you're aiming to take care of it? So what would you two say are kind of the critical components of arm care? And also too, rehab is unfortunately a part of the throwing and pitching process sometimes. Like, how important is it to kind of stay on the right schedule with rehab and to go through that the right way as you build that arm and that body back into shape to where it once was?
I'll start with, I think we want to work towards prehab before rehab. And the more that we can prepare the body and condition the body, I feel like we're going to have less injuries. I'm going to move also to a little bit of mechanics. That's a big term with pitching, their mechanics. And I think the more that I can feel my body when I'm in long toss and understand what my front side does, how my lower half works with it, is my arm on time. And we talk a lot about, in all phases of our game, we work easy, we want to be closed, and we want to be on time. So when I throw long toss, I'm really working easy because I want to feel my arm nice and loose. So to me, that's part of the arm care in the work itself. If I'm staying closed, I'm probably I've got good alignment. So it's probably cleaning up a lot of my mechanics without a lot of force from my front side. And we talk about backside hitting, backside pitching, really getting into your legs and feeling that, and then getting extension out over your front side. And so for me, if we're doing those phases correctly, our arm care becomes a part of it. Just like, and we've talked about this, Alan and I talked about this, the bullpen is literally the back end of my conditioning of my day. I'm not preparing for a bullpen. I'm working in my load to get to the final part, which is the bullpen. It's a part of it. So I think we need to just be cognitive of the entire process. And then going back to just listening. If I'm banged up that day, I'm going to back off a little bit. I think it's important that we stretch and we get the capsule back in place, and days that we have inflammation, then we have to address that. But I think it's much more about full body care. We have a tremendous strength coach, and it's not about getting huge and being big and massive. It's much more about functional strength. And then it becomes not only from position player to pitcher, but relief pitcher versus starting pitcher. And so all that's kind of calculated in how we do it. But I think at the end of the day, it's up to the player, and it's up to the player to be consistent with his throwing and with his conditioning to minimize the injuries. And we're all going to get banged up. Then you got to listen.
Yeah, I love it, David. I'm going to pick up from the full body, and then I'm going to talk about, because I love how he brought this into a holistic concept of arm care, as opposed to, we always think about arm care as pre. And I love how David brought this into this, that arm care has a lot to do with the throwing session itself, right? Or in the mechanical part of it. I'd actually say also tapping into your athleticism in the throwing piece as well is a huge part of the arm care. But I want to first tackle that pre-throwing. I think is sort of a given. There's a lot of things out there. We specialize in band work. I have a yoga background. I started doing yoga in the 90s. I taught yoga for 15, 18 years privately to players. So when you talk about body, when David talks about the body, trust me, we're all in on the body. So I think that's number one. We need to talk about the body and not only the arm, of course. But I want to pick up on another piece because I think that the pre-throwing is sort of a given. I want to talk about recovery as part of the arm care aspect. And now I'm going to come back to throwing again. In my experience, the more throwing you do from a volume point of view, and let's call it more of a lower intent, but just a conditioning day. And that could also include some pull downs if it's a pull down day, or a lot of pull downs. But the better condition you are, well, then the better you recover. And then the better you recover, then the better chance you're in a position to have another good volume day. Now, again, you have to be aware, as David said, right? There's days where maybe you can't do as much as you want, but it's sort of like throwing begets throwing, begets throwing, begets throwing. And I feel like the better for sure, the better you recover, you get into what we call a positive cycle. And all of a sudden, because you recover well, you can then have an opportunity to have a great work day in again, as opposed to you don't cover so well, and now you're not going to do as much, and you're not going to throw as much, and now you're putting yourself into what we call potentially a negative cycle. And also and that's what happens to relief pitchers, by the way, in professional baseball, is they're the extreme, in our opinion, my opinion, of this starting to happen. Because what happens is that they don't do a lot, generally speaking, then they go out and max effort it 3 or 4 hours later. The recovery, in our opinion, is not going to be, my opinion, is not going to be that good. Then they're not going to throw for sure as much, and they're already not throwing very much. And now all of a sudden it just starts shrinking. Then they're a little sore, maybe a little tighter, maybe they're using more effort at night, and all of a sudden they're in what we call a negative cycle. And I feel like with David and I, again, to keep coming back to this theme, is we're talking about, we want to get in a positive cycle like a BP pitcher. We want to be able to, you talk about arm care, you want to have great arm care, we'll obviously do your pre-stuff, of course. Tune into your body and your mechanics, listen to your body, get in a great long toss if possible on that day, or at least get in a lot of volume. But because you recover well is a massive piece to arm care.
Yeah.
What do guys do the day after a start? So many times they don't want to do much, and it's the most critical day for their next start. And it starts with, a good sweat. I got to get my body hot. Then I do my bands, my arm circles, and then I do my light toss, whatever that is. Maybe it's a little more. And I think the massage throwing is critical, more so than letting it eat. I think it's much more about getting extension, filling the looseness, and starting that recovery for the next day, the next start.
Yeah, Coach, you beat me to the punch on that, because my next question was going to be, we talked about there is an adjustment going from high school to college, but one of the things that tends to be pretty similar is that the starting pitchers are on a 7-day cycle. And for you, what does that look like for a Texas pitcher, a starter? What does their 7-day cycle look like as far as which days do they lift, throw bullpens, stuff like that? And then, for either one of you too, like, how much does that vary? Because a lot of the high school kids that are the better pitchers, a lot of them do play a position, and there's volume throwing potentially throughout the week for them, whether it be in a game or practice or whatever it may be. Can you both touch a little bit upon that, like what that 7-day cycle looks like, and then what, if anything, is different for a two-way guy?
Let me start with the 7-day, Alan, and you can pick up from there if that works.
Sure.
For me, a Friday night starter, when he gets the ball, I want him to have a mentality that it's his game and he's going the distance. So it all starts, first of all, of how he approaches that game. What's his mindset? Has he done his prep mentally as well as physically? Is he ready to compete? Once he goes out and, he empties the tank. That's what we want. It may be 4 stressful innings. It may be 7 pretty clean innings. And, he may have a shot to extend it. But I want that kid to feel that confidence and knowing that he's prepared for that. And that goes that's from his work. On Saturday, his job is to get up and get a good conditioning in. I'd like to see the body warm and hot and sweaty before we start doing anything else. As soon as we get that going, then we'll move into our arm care. If it's bands, if it's the combination of bands and arm circles. And some of the things we talk about is so simple, like simple arm circles. A lot of people tend to think that that's not enough. But what we're trying to do is get circulation, get movement, and then get into our band work for stretch, for having the ability to next put a ball in our hand. And then I want to play catch. If I have good normal soreness, then I'm going to probably get some length. Maybe it's 150, like Alan was saying earlier. Maybe it's 150 for 15 minutes, but your arm's going to let you know that. Your body's going to let you know that. And it's going to be loose and long, and then not a lot of pull down action. Day 2, now we're starting to move into extension. For me, it would be that Sunday, we're going to start working towards our long toss again. Monday, we're going to cut back to the 180, probably no pull downs. Tuesday, you're challenging me now, Drew. Monday, it's a shorter day. It's a flat ground. It's a lot of fill. I want to fill my pitches. And then Tuesday, again, based on how my body feels at this point, I want to get length again. Wednesday, I'm going to be short. For me, Thursday is going to be touch and fill, and I'm going to be as fresh as I can, ready to go on Friday. That's in a nutshell. Strength and conditioning around that. Usually after all my workload on Saturday, it's also a pretty heavy lift. Be my heavier lift day for my core, my legs, my back, my maintenance, and then my second lift of the week is going to be lighter. That's in season 7 days in a nutshell.
So our 7 days very similar to David's. Basically, I'll use the Friday analogy too, since David gave me the visual of the days to make it easier now. So Friday for us, I love what David said earlier about the bullpen, so to speak, is the finishing touch of the day. I look at the game very similarly, even though I know it's a longer outing than a bullpen, but I don't want guys to miss on the value again of their pregame. So they'll do their arm care as usual. The only difference we make is we still want our guys out to max distance pregame on the day of their start. So we'll take 300 feet as an example. We've backed off having them pull down a lot from 300 feet, let's say into 120. They can still start getting on top of the ball. But maybe from 120 in is when we start having them throw more with their pull down, so to speak. So day 1 is a normal long toss day minus maybe the workload on the pull downs till the very end. Day 2, and I can do this pretty quickly. Day 2, as David said, perfect analogy. Look, did the guy throw 112 pitches that weren't very stressful? Did he throw 64 pitches that were very stressful? Somewhere in the middle. Maybe they didn't, maybe got rained out and you threw 40 pitches. So the next day, we don't know. But let's just say pretty good workload. I'm going to say same thing, anywhere from 90 feet to 200 feet the next day. All what we call massage throws. All with a lot of arc, a lot of looseness and feel, as David said. No pulling down, no linear throwing. In fact, no linear throwing the first 3 days for us. Day 2, again, based on what happened on the start, David, we'll just say day 2 is probably going to be somewhere between 220 and 300 feet. They're going to be pushing back to the normal long toss distance, give or take. No pull downs. We only want, again, range of motion, circulation, as David said, volume building, and nothing really linear. It doesn't mean a guy can't come in and start feeling a little frisky. You know, they might start feeling pretty good if they only threw 60 pitches. But we're trying to set up day 3 and 4, which is setting up day 7 again. Now, day 3 is an interesting day. It depends on how heavy the start day was, but day 3 is now we're into a full long toss, full pull down day. Now, if the pitcher had a very intense start day, I'd probably push that day to day 4. But either way, what we're really trying to do, believe it or not, is we're really trying to set up a really good bullpen for day 4. And then have 2 days between day 4 and the start date to sort of deload a little bit, right? Keep the arm fresh, and then set up day 7, which is technically day 8 for the start. So full long toss and start day, 90 to 200 or so on day 1. Afterward, 220 to 300 on day 2. I'd say day 3 is sort of a normal pull down day and long toss day. That might be a pen day, a light pen day for somebody. In a perfect world, I'd kind of want to use day 3 to set up day 4. Day 4 is what we call our beast mode day. That's where we're going full long toss, full pull down, and pen. And now you have 2 full days to sort of recover from that pen and prepare the arm the way you need to. And as David said, so the day 5 for us might be after a pen, might be 200, 220, just stretching. And then the day before is, like David said, is more just sort of 90 to 180, stretch it out, get some throwing in. And then the start day is back to where we were.
Yeah, and there's certain guys that may need 2 bullpens a week, just because that we talk a lot about care. We talk a lot about arm strength, body conditioning. I think the more that you throw, the more you build command. And that's missing in our game right now. And so, if I'm throwing frequently and I'm throwing to targets and I've got to focus, I can only get better with my command. And that's critical. And a lot of times we'll go to a second bullpen because a guy's not commanding it. But if you look back at his work, is he focusing on command as well as strength and conditioning?
And I'll just throw one other quick thing on top of that, which is, here's the irony. The more throwing you do, as David said, right, the better feel you're going to tend to get. I actually find from guys doing a lot of throwing during the week, and a lot of it includes long toss, that they're building that proprioception, they're building the feel. They're also building the connection with their body, because when you throw the ball at 10, 20, 30 degrees, all these different increments as you go out, and then all these different increments as you come in, you're building a very strong intuitive connection to your body and your release point. So I would actually say that, again, guys can go on the mound and even at 50% and get used to the slope. But I would also say that the beauty of this topic today is that you can build incredible command and feel and accuracy from the long toss and the throwing itself. And it can actually, I had a pitcher, this is a long time ago, but he was a minor leaguer at the time, and Derek Lowe came down from the big leagues with the Braves. And I know this is one pitcher, but it's a good example. And someone asked him after he did his little talk to the minor leaguers, that one of the pitchers asked him, what do your pens look like during the week? And Derek Lowe happened to be a massive long toss guy. And the funny thing is that we remember he's like a 3/4 with a movement guy, ironically. Mm-hmm. He said, I don't want to say he doesn't ever pen, but maybe the period of time he was in, he was saying that I don't either pen much or I don't get on the mound much between starts because I get my feel from my long toss. And again, I might have ruined the story because I don't really remember exactly what he said, but I just remember when my kid told me this, that it just was a reminder that bullpens, we all know, are important. It's great. It's important to get on the slope. But I think part of the theme today is that this idea that it's unbelievable how much feel and accuracy you can build from just throwing.
Yeah, think of what we hear now with, finger pressure and grips and spins and slots. And I mean, just getting out and long tossing and just feeling the ball in your fingers and the different effort points. And I got to think there probably can't be a better way to work on those things. Guys, we've kept you long enough, but before we get out of here, is there one thing that's maybe a misconception about, just throwing all the time and arm care or something like that you feel, kind of bugs you and you want to talk about before we get out of here, or maybe one more point that maybe we didn't touch on enough that you really want listeners to take home with them? Drew and I, we do a lot of these podcasts. We have a lot of listeners that are going to be high school players, high school parents. some college as well, and things like that. But maybe something that's kind of critical for those guys that might be in their prep development as they're trying to learn of, the balance of building arm strength and stuff and performance, but also, taking care of the arm and how to develop that feel and keep that athleticism and things like that.
Dave, you can take it.
Go ahead. You started, Alan.
I was punting to you. I would say this, whenever this comes up, and it's a really cool question, Dustin. A couple things always come to mind. One is to be super mindful of what you're doing during the summer and even really the fall. And by that, what I mean is we're talking about throwing right now, right? That's the topic today. We're talking about training. We're talking about development. We're talking about feel. We're talking about athleticism. Let's remember that that's the base and foundation to us. And so we all want to go out and play and pitching games, and we need to, and it helps us get better, and we have to work on stuff. But I think to your question, which is a great question, I think that what it's done is it's sort of maybe skewed us to the point of where we're competing a lot and we're playing a lot. And I remember my first six-fold, this is pre-internet, our first six-fold brochure for the first camps we ever did in the early 90s. It was a camp in 8 weeks in the summer, just training, conditioning, and a lot of mental stuff. And I remember one of the flaps, it said, "What are you doing this summer?" Basically, playing or training. And I wrote a little paragraph on the value, because the best piano players in the world, the best guitarists in the world, right, and the best dancers in the world, they're practicing 6-8 hours a day. Whatever the number is, right? That they're training. Now, again, I don't want to make this seem like we can't go out and play, but I think if I were to leave the listeners with one reminder, train and develop and play. By the way, training is playing. Long toss and throwing is fun. Coming in from a good long toss session and throwing 25 changeups or 30 because your arm feels so great is fun. That's working on your craft too. And I just feel like that we've gotten too much into the playing world and the games world and the tournaments world. There's a time and a place for it. But I would leave everybody with this idea of train. And lastly is to listen to your arm and body, and to know that playing catch a couple of times a week and then going out and pitching is dangerous. You have to condition the base. You have to do a lot of throwing in a smart way and not shock the arm. So those, I guess, would be my two final points.
Yeah, that's a lot to follow. I will say this, throwing's your foundation. And I'm just going to harp and say the same thing that Alan's saying. But, I think kids nowadays, high school, college kids, are chasing velocity. And I think train for your velocity. And if you're training correctly, your body's going to work correctly through maturation. You're going to get to your peak. And I think we get in a hurry and we think that we have to. And that's coming from a Division I Power 5 coach that has to recruit the best kids in the country. But at the same time, natural movement, athleticism, natural slots, and not really chasing it, but training for it. And understanding that a lot of this information out there has programmed us. And so we spend a lot of time deprogramming. Not to say that, again, I'll go back to not to say that it's bad, good, indifferent. My point is, if we build off of the foundation, the other ones, and I'm going to use Alan's word, are supplements for it, but we have to throw.
Very well said. And guys, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to talk about this. The crazy thing is we've cruised through a lengthy podcast, and we haven't even talked about the mental side of throwing, which I know both you guys are extremely, extremely passionate about. So we might have to tackle that one on another podcast. But Alan, if anybody wants to get, your resources, your information, I'm assuming JaegerSports.com is the best way for them to get hooked up with all that. We mentioned the year-round throwing manual, which I gotta think is kind of regarded as like a Bible for some people, just because of the way it explains and it lays out the calendar and throwing and how to throw properly, how to when to do this, when to do that, what stage you are in your development, your throwing. You can get all that in the year-round throwing manual and go to jagersports.com for all the great resources there. Follow you on Twitter at Jagersports as well. David, anything you want to plug before we get out of here? I know
Dustin, you're forgetting our NIL question.
Oh, I forgot, Drew. Yeah, Drew, this is your wheelhouse. This is one of our favorite questions. This is one of our favorite questions to ask our guests.
This is something we ask all the coaches because it tells about your personality. And, Coach, I know you have experience with NIL, but we didn't get to play in the NIL era, which I know means that you didn't get to play in the NIL era. For both of you,
Right.
like if you were a college player right now playing at University of Texas or wherever it is that you want to play, what kind of NIL deals would you be out there looking for?
Cash. However I get it.
I've always been someone that I'm pretty simple. I like, nice gear and, a nice pullover. And nowadays, because I play tennis, actually, I ask from coaches, like if they want to send a hat out or something. I'm like, do you have shorts with Coach David? Do you have shorts with pockets in them? Because for tennis, I need pockets.
All right, that's good.
Ball. So I would probably just be more.
Well, then I will go here. Then I would say unlimited golf balls.
No,
because I use a lot of them.
I was gonna say, is that because of your swing or because you play so much?
Much more about my swing than my frequency.
And to be fair to you, golf balls are pretty expensive if you're playing with some good golf balls to try to help out with the spin and everything like that. So that's good. Well, usually Drew and I always end up food related for some reason. So
yeah, you both are foodies.
Leave it to you two to have the actual movement activity element of this NIL discussion. Tennis and some golf balls. Those are good ones. Original picks for the 5-Tool podcast from our guests. But Alan and David, again, thank you so much for jumping on board. We really appreciate it. I learned a ton from this. Obviously, my playing days are long gone, but I learned a lot. I know that listeners learned a lot. And again, you get to jagersports.com and read about Alan and find all those resources. And obviously, you know where to find Coach David Pierce over at Ditchflock Field and on Twitter and so forth. So for Alan and David and Drew, I'm Dustin McComas. Thanks for tuning into the 5-Tool podcast. Until we talk to y'all next time, take care.